but I'm standing here today as the interim executive director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this public forum on our suite of integrity legislation in Barbados. We are pleased to partner with Integrity Group Barbados on the eve of our Global Ethics celebrations for 2023. So this chat amongst our panelists, moderated by one of our fine members of ICAB, serves as one of ICAB's and Integrity Group Barbados's opportunities to build the awareness about the legislation, but more importantly, to empower you as members not only of ICAB or Integrity Group Barbados, but just as average citizens, to hold persons serving in public life accountable. And so, without further ado, I will invite my friend and colleague, who happens to also chair a committee of ICAB, Mr. Andy Armstrong of Integrity Group Barbados, to bring some brief remarks.
Thank you, Lisa, and good evening, everyone. And don't get worried, I'm not reading all of this. It's just I wanted to make sure I didn't miss a few keywords. But it's great to be here and to see everyone here coming to support us tonight. As Lisa said, I'm the current chair of Integrity Group Barbados, Inc. We formed as a voluntary group around late 2016, and we took the decision to incorporate in 2019 because we thought if we're talking about integrity, we need to make sure everything is in place. And being in a room of accountants, you'll be pleased to know that we have our audited financials completely up to date. Integrity Group Barbados, there's basically 4 specific objectives we're looking at. Is to stimulate and initiate debate and discussion on the issue of integrity, to educate and provide information to the public, to build linkages with groups with similar objectives, and therefore ICAB has been a natural ally since the very beginning, and to lobby for policy change which advances integrity in public life. And this year we're obviously very pleased because we put a lot of effort into trying to do what we could to make sure the Integrity in Public Life Bill 2023 passed through both houses. And some of us, including me, were there at the Senate when they voted, and it was a very exciting moment. So we're very happy that we got that support and we have the bill, which is a very, very necessary step, but we know that's not the end of the journey. And this is why I'm looking forward to the panel discussing, where do we go from here now that we have the legislation. So again, thank you everyone for coming out. If you want to know more about Integrity Group, we're very open. Anyone who's concerned with integrity, we're very happy to welcome you. And you can reach out to me or to ICAB and get my information. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I am Dr. Gayatri Mahabir. I'm a chartered accountant in public practice and a member of ICAB's Ethics, Governance, and Risk Committee. It's my pleasure to be here this evening to moderate this panel of eminent persons on the discussion of the integrity legislations in Barbados. We shall discuss what the public should be aware of regarding the legislation and how they can become involved in ensuring the legislation works to promote transparency and objectivity in public service. Let's introduce our panelists. Retired Justice Christopher Blackman has served his profession and Barbados well since he was admitted to the bar. He's a former independent senator of Barbados Parliament, a former justice in the Court of Appeals in Barbados, in Bahamas and Belize, former director of several publicly listed companies in the region. He currently serves his country in the capacity as chairman of the Employment Rights Tribunal and chairman of the Constitutional Reform Commission. Senator Kevin Boyce, attorney at law, is an independent senator in the Barbados Parliament and a partner in a local law firm. Senator Boyce's practice specializes in commercial and civil litigation for local and regional clients, and he's an active member of the Rotary Club of Barbados West. Mr. Alistair Archer is an attorney at law practicing in private practice in the areas of civil and family litigation and conveyancing. Alistair has was a columnist for local news outlet for over 6 years and currently a director on the boards of two media enterprises. Mr. Devon Bruce is a political scientist at the University of the West Indies with more than a decade of experience in the field, including research, psychology, writing, and publications that span the political landscape in Barbados and across the region. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Okay, shall we start with the first question? How do the two pieces of legislation we're discussing, the Integrity in Public Life and Prevention of Corruption Act, work with each other? Who would like to take the first one? Mr. Boyce, Senator Boyce.
Good evening, everyone. That is a very interesting question. Now, I think the starting point has to be that the government of Barbados was very clear that there was going to be a suite of legislation brought forward to aid in the public, and the stated goal with regard to treatment and advancement of the fight against corruption. So the 5 pieces of legislation that were set out are, of course, the Integrity in Public Act, the Prevention of Corruption Act, which are the two that you just mentioned, but there's also the whistleblower legislation, the public procurement legislation, and the anti-corruption agency legislation, which established the anti-corruption agency. So the two pieces that we're talking about, integrity in public life and prevention of corruption, work together as one, being part and parcel of the suite of legislation brought in for the purpose of fighting corruption. Integrity in public life really focus on the actions of politicians, public servants, or persons who have a role to play as in chairman of certain statutory corporations and, of course, government agencies with a certain risk that has been assessed and is set out within the schedule of the legislation. The Prevention of Corruption Act is a bit wider and, of course, incorporates the UN Convention of 2003. And the real focus of this is, of course, to allow for the prevention of persons who may be practicing corruption, but not necessarily in the public sphere, but with private entities. So the way they work together is that you have the integrity in public life, which deals with those who serve in a public-facing capacity or a public manner, while the prevention of corruption casts a wider net and also goes after private individuals. One thing which is important to recognize that from both pieces of legislation, though they do carry a penalty, and not necessarily in the context of monetary or jail time, is that they both have a potential where if you're convicted under either, there's a restriction against you serving in public office. So the short answer is the two pieces of legislation, Integrity in Public Life and Prevention of Corruption Act, form part of the government's suite of legislation to fight corruption. Those are 5 pieces of legislation that were brought in. Those are 2 of them. If I were to say the distinguishing factor between the two is that integrity in public life focuses on, let's say, politicians and persons who serve in the public, while prevention of corruption casts a wider net, goes after private individuals, and is representative of the government's incorporation of the UN Convention of 2003.
Thank you very much. Any comments? Any questions from the audience?
When we had this sort of prepping for this exercise, one of the things that we recognize that the legislation is silent on what I call the silent cancer of corruption, and that is financing of the political parties. Now, by a curious bit of serendipity, last Thursday, the Constitutional Reform Commission had a session online with a body out of Stockholm called the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, who made a presentation to us of some 90 minutes on the whole issue of campaign financing. And they set down a hypothetical form of proposals for the commission to consider to include in our recommended proposals. And before the meeting started, I made a gift of that package to the acting executive director. So it's part of your records. My concern about the legislation that has been passed is it just a matter of what I call ticking a box. In my research for this exercise, I reflected upon the fact that 48 years ago, in 1975, the government of the day passed a piece of legislation creating a Teaching Services Commission. That commission is not yet operational. And I am concerned that we are not creating something to satisfy Mr. Armstrong and his pressure group. And it doesn't happen. If the integrity in public life commission and all these nice things are to become a reality, the government must put in place someone of the stature and regard in the community to make it happen. There's a lot of work to be done to make it operational. The need to find a chairman who is someone who has held the office of a judge, and they need not be a Barbadian. In fact, I would recommend a chairman from outside of Barbados. So the executive project officer should have the capacity to reach out across the region and across the Commonwealth at large to find the inaugural chairman. And curiously enough, when the Turks and Caicos were looking to have an integrity commission in place, they reached out to Barbados. And so David Simmons served as their first chairman of their integrity commission. So there's no shame in looking to outside for a chairman. But that is my premise to start with. There must be a commitment to make it happen and to do what is necessary. So, and it's not just finding a chairman. We must also find the facilities to make it happen. We are very good at creating things, but not putting the resources behind it. For 4.5 years, I served as chairman of a body that I regarded as being a vagrant, because we had no home to call our own. I will not call that body's name. I will not want to wish that on the integrity legislation, integrity commission. I rest now.
Thank you. So the guidelines you were speaking of for this commissioner, this inaugural commissioner, are those set already? Or are we going to use Turks and Caicos' guidelines as part of our guidelines?
Well, the person I'm speaking of is not a commissioner. He is really a project officer to go around and make things happen, to bring into play. I'm sure there are a lot of you in this room who are young enough or old enough to remember the creation of the Barbados National Bank in the late 70s, early 80s. And for that to happen, the government of the day identified Mr. Harcourt Lewis, a permanent secretary, to make it happen. Things don't happen by chance. If you really want them to happen, you put the resources behind them. The central bank didn't grow by topsy. They had a team to make it happen. So if this body is to become meaningful and not just be something where we tick a box and report to international agencies, we have passed the legislation. We're wasting time. And as I say that, we need to look at even the act as it is being presently drafted. There's a glaring breach in the act in that there's a recipe for frustration. It's a commission of 6 with no casting vote given to the chairman. A simple provision would be to say a 7th person appointed by the president in his or her discretion of a person of high integrity. But there should always be an odd number for bodies such as this. And if there's, and if you keep in 6, then put in a cast and vote mechanism as you have under the Commission of Inquiries Act. There's some simple basic things to be done. Now, I am reliably advised that really in the passage through the Senate, there were attempts made to have this amendment. But I don't know what the rush for was, except to probably make Mr. Armstrong happy. But the leader of government business did not take it on, and they said, no, get back at another time. But the opportunity should be taken to look at the legislation, identify where the weak points are, because I think what IDEA has said to us in terms of campaign financing is critical. I regard campaign financing as what I call the third leg of the stool. You don't need a four-seated chair on which you're sitting. It's just a stool. Campaign financing ties in with the public life and all the other procurement issues of which you speak. Because it is in campaign financing that the favors are sought and bargained for. Right. And we need to have a structure that we recognize that, look, you know what? We know everybody gives the political parties. Both sides get, except in the run-up, in the last 3 days, someone decides, you know what? They're getting ahead, so God sweeten the pot for them. It's in sweeten the pot that the obligation may arise to be a point of referral downstream when you run into somebody at Oystins on a Friday night. You remember so-and-so? No. Time to deliver. I rest, man.
Thank you. Thank you, Justice Blackman. Senator Boyce, did you want to weigh in on specifically on the need for adequate resources for the commission?
I almost thought you were asking me to weigh in on what Justice Blackman has said. So I've learned in my short foray into public life how to leave certain balls alone. So I would leave that delivery for Justice Blackman. In terms of the resources, it's one of those things where we can definitely learn from our neighbors, Trinidad to the south and Jamaica to the north. You have a recent situation where in Trinidad, the director of the Integrity Commission came out and said it's hard enough with all their resources, funding the commission, operating, maintaining the amount of files that they have to do. But he also raised a practical concern. He says, whenever we start an investigation, we are met with a battalion of senior counsel in relation to the person who we're investigating. And we don't have the resources to go after these persons who utilize their financial means to obtain legal services to protect them. And if we are reliant on our limited resources, we can't go toe-to-toe when we have these battles. And I thought that to be indicative of what's going to be an issue with regard to whether or not the commission is able to effectively execute its mandate. So that's the first thing, the fact that we do have empirical evidence as to what happens. Second issue is the structure which contemplates the utilization of already beleaguered resources such as the DPP to provide assistance to the commission when we do see the excellent work that the DPP department is doing, but they do not necessarily have the manpower at this time. So the question is whether funding and the necessary legislation will be put in place to provide those resources. The marshal's office as well is under a certain amount of pressure and has an obligation with a variety of courts in Barbados, and they're the ones who will be tasked with assisting the commission. So I am going to assume that the government will have those resources put into place, and that will be a factor with the commission being able to run effectively. That's just some practical concerns off the bat. You then have to think about the concept of the storage of the very detailed forms which the commission will be receiving, the necessary security, the concerns about data protection in terms of what they receive, something as simple as where these items will be stored and the resources to store them adequately and for them to be retrieved. As accountants, you guys are aware that, sometimes you're very good at putting things away, but when it comes time to retrieve after a certain period, the accountants use the 6-year or 7-year rule. Well, in this instance, the requirement is 5 years after you cease public life, and then you have that time starting to run. So all these are factors which say that, yes, it's definitely an idea whose time has come, but you're going to need to put some money behind it for it to be effective.
Over the last 5 years, IGB has been making representation that the financing of this commission is a problem. The legislative provisions are a problem as it relates to how it is to be financed. The persons who are the subject matter of the legislation cannot be the ones who determine how much money and when the commission is funded. We have suggested a facility such as that, which obtains with the CCJ, where they get their money and then it is invested, etc., or whatever, to ensure the viability of the institution. But I cannot see how the Minister of Finance is the one who is essentially determine what a commissioner is to be paid, what the commission is to get, therefore which impacts on how many staff members the commission can have, etc. What resources the police force will have in order to be able to carry out the mandates of the commission as far as it comes to investigation and so on. That I wouldn't say that it has fallen on deaf ears, but the response has always been that there is no money for the kind of things that we are suggesting. But at some point, you have to find the money if you're really serious about what it is that you are doing. And it is a glaring deficiency as far as the establishment of the Integrity Commission and therefore the entire operation of the integrity legislation going forward, that as far as we can see. We have also made representation that campaign financing must be included in some legislative provision somewhere. The UN Convention Against Corruption, the 2003 Act, which is specifically incorporated into the proceeds of crime legislation, specifically requires the government to enact legislation which makes provision for monitoring campaign donations, etc. It must come. Whether it's a box-ticking exercise, at this point in time, where it's not 1975, there are endless international agencies that are breathing down our neck, and certain things must come. In addition to that, the entire thing must be underpinned by freedom of information. There is no commission with 6 people, 7 or 20 who can possibly police all of the infractions that take place across the political and private sector landscape in Barbados. You have to be able to facilitate the ordinary member of the public in being able to find information, make the report, or even if not the ordinary member of the public, at least the fourth estate, the press, needs to be able to investigate and bring certain matters to light. Those things all have to form part of the suite of legislation. And I realize, and we have realized that for years we have been circling this entire concept of freedom of information, whether it is open data or otherwise. But without that, the entire thing falls flat. Without the whistleblower, the entire thing falls flat because I'm not making a complaint to jeopardize my pension when some politician can then determine whether or not my family eats going forward. You have to protect people, and you can't expect the public to buy into the entire scheme unless they are in fact protected. And that is the problem that we see as it relates to the financing, as to how the whole thing is meant to work together.
Thank you. So it sounds right now that it's a circle we're going around it and we can't get out of that circle. So what is our move forward? What are the suggestions?
Well, let me just jump in. I wear my independent crown very tightly, but I think we need to recognize that the government has done something. And I think that is something which objectively they have achieved what they said they will do in terms of the passing of the legislation. So I think we need to recognize that what's interesting is the narrative that because in 2000, some years back, it was also something which the Frondell Stewart administration had said that they were going to get through. So now we have a situation where it has gotten through. So we actually have the legislation. So I think we need to recognize that, yes, we're circling, but at least we can say we have maybe a vector with regard to where we're going next. So I just wanted to put that plug.
The IGB through Mr. Armstrong has repeatedly given the government their flowers. We are quite frankly elated that at least one of our objectives has been achieved. We've got the legislation, but it needs to be built out, and it needs to be built out in a sensible fashion is all that we're saying.
Yes.
And the building out of that legislation is really what we have to start thinking about. So reference is made, for instance, to Jamaica. And I think Jamaica has the most established integrity framework in the region, if you ask me. And one of the interesting things that Jamaica recognized initially was that the management of the legislation determined how well it was implemented and how well follow-up occurred, and therefore the effectiveness. So Jamaica, for instance, had its Contractor General, it had the Prevention of Corruption Act, it had the integrity legislation. And what they recognized is in managing these various pieces of legislation, you had issues of duplication, you had issues of resources. We understand how our bureaucratic system works. Something falls off the truck. Someone goes on vacation and nobody sees the file. So we understand how these things become a problem. So what Jamaica has done is, in essence, created a one-stop shop where they have blended the expertise and blended all the legislation onto one body. So they no longer have a contractor general, for instance. They have an integrity commission that also deals with those issues because they recognize that managerially you have problems in rolling out duplication of efforts, persons not knowing what responsibility they have. For instance, we know when you have referrals of interagencies, for instance, bad communication, bad administration, and what's not. So why not pull everything under one entity and have that one-stop shop? And I think when we look at the legislation in Barbados, that seems not to be the case. We're actually seemingly heading in the direction of a multi-agency type of approach. And why do I say that? If you look, for instance, at the whistleblowing legislation, you have a whole host of agencies who can make disclosures to blow the whistle, so to speak. And the Integrity Commission is not one of them. So you can make a disclosure to the chief medical officer, for instance, but the Integrity Commission is not part of that. And when you look at the Prevention of Corruption Act, for instance, as well, too, there's no explicit mention of the Integrity Commission. The referrals would be to the police force, for instance. So you have that multi-agency situation where nobody's going to know who's responsible for what. You're going to have a situation where things can go missing, for instance, expertise issues, staffing issues, the usual issues that we see repeated in our bureaucratic system. We're just creating another aspect of that and recreating those issues. So we have to start thinking about how do we take the legislation in a direction where you don't have those managerial issues. And currently, we don't seem to recognize that that is exactly where we're going as a country.
Thank you. Would anybody in the audience like to weigh in on what has been said? Thank you.
just make the point because, I was there when the Senate voted on the integrity bill, and one of the independent senators did raise an amendment to include political parties under that legislation. It got support from all the independent senators, but nothing from the government side. And there was a recognition from someone on the government side that this is not a statement, that this is not the time to deal with that. We understand we have to deal with it at some point, but not now.
Thank you. Okay, so these pieces of legislation are obviously available for public review. Has there been any public engagement, or have you had feedback from the average citizen on these legislations? Maybe suggestions as to the recruitment of the commissioner or any areas like this?
Citizen. People do know that I'm a member of IGB, so most likely I'll get attacked by lawyers. I don't know if they fall within the definition of average citizen. But I find in Barbados, the average person really doesn't think this has anything to do with them. They don't. They don't see, they don't understand necessarily what corruption is, whether it's on a micro level. They might understand a politician is corrupt because he's taken a bribe. Everybody gets that. But there are other layers to it that they don't get. Where you pass a bribe to get a driver's license, that's corruption. They don't see how it affects them. They don't see the trickle down effect that all of the money that does not go into the treasury comes out in taxes, essentially, because the government must have money to operate, fix the roads, etc. So if they lose that revenue because it's gone in a bribe instead of into the consolidated fund, then it comes out in another direction. I think that this, for instance, I mean, granted, it's a small audience. I don't know if it's online, but we need to take this to the town square, not to LESC or any of these highfalutin places or what have you. We need to put on some polos and some slacks or whatever and go down in, I think it's Heroes Square now or something, and have a public discussion with literally the ordinary man on the street and explain to them from the ground up what this means. Explain to, well, it's not in only one of these two pieces of legislation is actually active right now. The Integrity and Public Life Bill is not as yet in operation. But explain before it becomes in operation to certain people in the public service that this affects you. Yeah. Somebody may not realize that they are effectively, your title may not be permanent secretary or head of department in that sense, but you may actually fall within the category of person who is in the schedule to the act, and you may or may not know. So I think that there is a lot of public awareness, public education, breaking things down line by line for people that needs to take place. Yes, this is a start. It needs to filter down, but certain groups, we have finite resources. I think that there's an onus on the government itself to facilitate the education of the ordinary member of the public before this thing becomes a reality.
Right.
Actually, before you get to the public, you need to speak to your public officers. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of public officers may not be aware that they're caught up with it. And it's not only public officers, but their spouses and their children who may live with them. There are a host of forms to be completed in the Integrity Act. Disclosures relating to insurance, cars, you name it, mortgages. It is very intrusive and invasive of your private information. And people need to be aware of the provisions of it. And I think there's going to be need, as Alicia said, for a serious public education program so that all the will-be candidates for elective office in the year of grace 2027. Now, I am being probably a little previous in naming the date for the Prime Minister, but I'm going on the basis it's 5 years from last time round, unless there's a need for a snap election to get another mandate. But that notwithstanding, whenever people are up to run, they need to familiarize themselves with this act. And and perhaps my good friend Kevin or his replacement in the Senate will have to decide, do I want to be in the Senate so that I must then tell everybody about the little small change I have parked in Sweden. All right. Um, so it might make life very difficult for those people like my young friend Devon Bruce, who have multiple girlfriends and have to support them the lifestyle to which they got accustomed. Y'all getting so serious that at one point, Kevin asked me, how do you lighten up this crowd? And do I know any good accounting jokes? And since things are getting a little, but I just want to say that I believe in fair square. I will never tell an accountant joke before bring it back to lawyers. And lawyers give the best. Lawyers are have the best reputation for when they say if a lawyer falls in the shark-infested waters, he comes out unscathed. Because they pay him a courtesy of equal. I mean of a fellow traveler. So the only small joke I would tell that reflects on accountants and lawyers is that of the elderly priest who was not doing too well. And he sent a message to ask his lawyer and his accountant to come sit by his bedside. And eventually they came, and he sat down on either side, and he said nothing. Now, lawyers and accountants charged by the hour. And after it reached back to an hour and a half, I'm not sure whether it was the senior counsel or the accountant said, wait a minute, let the old man know that this is costing. So I think the accountant pressed the old man, Father Andrew, why do you have us here? You know, time is money. My sons, is always be my prayer and hope that I will die like our Lord. Between two thieves. And with that, Father Andrew died. Now, so as I said, I will not exempt lawyers from that ignominy. But seriously, this is serious legislation. And I discovered when I went to Belize 6 years ago, which I has never been aware of, no, 9 years ago, that was a PEP. I never knew that I had been a PEP all the while before. But since Enron, I discovered I'm a PEP. And a PEP means you're a politically exposed person. And not only does it mean I was a PEP, but my wife became a PEP. So when she bought a car, they asked her all sorts of evasive questions. And thank God my children have moved to my house. If not, it will affect their careers and going forward. Right? Thank God Lisa no longer lives with me. If not, she have this. That Lisa over there. Right? But no, seriously, I think, as Alicia says, there's a serious public education needed on the forms here in this legislation to all the public officers. And one of the things I suggest, however, ICAB may do is to do one of those simple flyer handouts. Do you know that? Are you, do you know that you have to do this? Are you aware that you're caught by this? Simple handouts to give without in the supermarket or anywhere there's going to be a public passageway and make people aware of what the implications are. You know. But the critical thing is, although we've moved on from, we have to ensure that we've given the government flowers for doing it. They must not sit on it. And therefore, they must do what is necessary not to treat it the way of the Service Commission of 1975. And there's other legislation. The government passed in 2008 a Public Service Appeal Board to deal with the myriad of disciplinary matters in the public service. It has not been brought into effect. That is the issue. That is the issue. There's no point in doing ticking box issues. Now, the notion, Alicia, of funding it is interesting. But even the CCJ model has had problems because over time, the CCJ has had to dip into that capital fund to meet some of their operational expenses. So what it calls for me, that this must be seen as a first step. And we need to go back in a way to a drawing board where, in fact, your group, ICAP, the bar, civil society at large, need to sit down and have a discussion of really what is required to make this, and send back a memorandum to government that you need to look at these things to make it a reality.
If I can jump in really quickly here, I think that's a very important point because it speaks to purpose. And if you look at the Jamaican model, for instance, they've created divisions that are responsible for various things. So they have three divisions. One is for investigation, one is for prosecution, and one is administration. The administrative division, interestingly enough, is responsible in part for the public education. So you have a director who can pull together the civil society groups, pull together government, put together political parties, put together individuals, and develop what that public engagement would look like, whether you tap into social media, whether you tap into flyers, whether you tap into whatever, and you have that public education aspect involved. The issue that we have with our legislation here is that it speaks to commissioners or members on the commission, but it does not give them a purpose. Jamaica has developed a purpose. So you have three distinct agencies, or rather one agency with three distinct divisions who have a singular purpose. If you look at our legislation, you have 6 commissioners, you have a chairman, but we don't know what they're actually going to be responsible for. So that is why you have to create purpose in what you're doing, and our legislation falls short of that. I would also say, for instance, that I have concerns regarding whether it's a part-time job, because when you look at the legislation, it speaks to the commission coming together and meeting when they think necessary, as opposed to a Monday to Friday 8 to 4 job, as in Jamaica, where it's a full-time responsibility. So those are the type of things we have to start thinking about when it comes to the implementation of these things, because Justice Blackman spoke, for instance, about other committees who have, not having a house, not having the funding, not having the sufficient resources and what's not, because they don't have a specific purpose. And I think that is absent in our space.
Before we move off, I also think it prudent to mention that the debate in relation to the integrity in life is available online. You can go and see the points that were made. Mr. Armstrong was there, so he was able to witness it firsthand and the variety of commentary that resulted as coming out of it. But I think it prudent to mention the fact that Senator Tate, who laid out quite extensively the list of persons who would be impacted by the legislation. And the concept needs to be dissolved that it's just political persons. It's also persons in the public sector with a certain seniority. And she was at pains to go through the schedules to point out persons who may not be aware that they will be impacted. Also, persons who serve as chairman, etc., etc. And also, we should also say that the government has expressly stated that there will be a public education campaign with regard to the rollout. So, of course, pressure groups like yourself will continue to hold them accountable, promises made, promises kept, all that good stuff, so that we should hopefully see that campaign. So, the 2 points I wanted to make was that one, the fact that persons who will be impacted need to be made aware was set out strenuously by Senator Tate, and the fact that the government has recognized and has stated that it will be rolling out an extensive campaign. Now, when you look at the fact that this is a legislation that will come in by proclamation, my suggestion would be to give persons time to get the house in order. However, as we all know, the more time you give, the more time persons will take. So invariably, you will find yourself with a rush. That's for the powers that be to figure out. But those 2 points I thought prudent to add to the discussion that we're having.
Thank you. Okay, so we've pointed out. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. I really came here to just sit down quietly and say nothing. But I'm one of those loudmouths who get on brass tacks and say what they think, frankly. And Justice Blackman raised, to my mind, a very, very important point when he spoke about the question of, well, I'm using my own words, invasion of people's privacy. And he mentioned the person who has a few pennies in a Swiss bank somewhere. Well, tomorrow I'm attending a webinar on some strange things called the Financial Action Task Force and something strange called the travel rule. And what that essentially is about is you have an unelected organization called the FATF, we call it FATF for short, that is putting pressure on the governments to implement things that are not necessarily in the interests of their citizens. So the travel rule is about telling us how much money we need to disclose if we are trading in cryptocurrencies to some public body, even though there may not be legislation or policy or anything like regulation, or anything like that, that addresses the issue, or no discussion among the populace about the invasion of their privacy. So when Justice Blackman talk about the privacy concerns, I think we need to hear a bit more about that, because I am very, very concerned about these things called the FATF and the belief in certain circles in government that because it has been imposed on us from over and above, from these organizations that are unelected, we have nothing that we can do about it. I think that's a lot of nonsense. And I think we need to get to understand what these organizations are doing and what they're all about. So sorry about the intervention, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
The issue of privacy came up in the first debate in 2020 in terms of this bill, or the version that was similar to this bill. And the issue which was flagged in the Senate was the disclosure requirements as then set out meant that anyone can go and say, may I see Justice Blackman's information? What that realized was that that information, because you have to list all your assets, would include where you reside, would include where your partner resides if they reside somewhere differently, will include where your bank accounts are, will include a variety of information which will be recognized as a security risk. As a result of the concerns raised, it was then determined that while there is going to be a process to access the information, you won't be able to blithely walk off of the street and say, let me see the information in relation to Justice Blackman. And there will be stricture with regard to the commissioners, with regard to the access that they have. That ties into the point that Alicia made with regard to the freedom of information legislation, which allows you to make your requests for the information, but therefore they're aware as to who is making the request, so that heaven forbid something is that information is used for the wrong purpose, they're able to identify, maybe too late for you, but they'll be able to identify what caused the issue. In terms of the point you made in terms of pressure groups and government and things being imposed, I believe that that is something which all governments in the region are dealing with. For what we are talking about presently, though, the integrity in public life, the issue of security is one which has been addressed by the legislation. It may find itself in the future causing a friction with persons who want access to the information. And I think that still has to be worked out. So the point you raise is one that was subject to debate in 2020. And as a result of that debate, we now have an act which has tried to deal with the requirements of disclosure to make them a little less obvious for persons to use it for nefarious means. Now, the point you're raising about travel rules and pressure groups, I got the same email. I see the discussion on tomorrow in terms of gray markets and all that type of stuff. I don't believe we're there yet, but yes, that is something which governments are being pressured to incorporate, and that will fall under the AML mandate and all the other issues that we have. But for now, under our integrity legislation and the suite of legislation, there is still a pretty decent attempt to keep the information that is provided private.
One of the ways of trying to keep people's business out from too much scrutiny in a real way is that the legislation provides for blind trust, which is a standard process by which in the metropolitan countries people put their investments in the hands of a trustee who will make trades for their on behalf of the beneficiary of the trust without necessary reference back. When one reads, however, of some of the, and I was used a nice word the other day, the shenanigans in the U.S. Congress, it seems that notwithstanding blind trust, someone always seems to be able to dispose of their shares or buy shares just before or after a significant event so that they will not either suffer a loss or have the opportunity to make a gain. I don't think there's enough real activity on any exchange in Barbados that really has to be an issue. So in large measure, the blind trust in Barbados is going to be serve what it's worth. The bigger question for me, however, and you as an accountant must know, are there enough accountants, service providers, to provide the blind trust for the 51 members of parliament, plus all the statutory boards and those chairmen, plus public officers, the potential pool of persons who could be subject to the blind trust is what, 500? Conservatively? Well, you're 203. So you've crunched your numbers.
I was also going to add, Justice Blackman, it's not just a matter of holding the assets in the trust. You are also actively making sure that those investments are growing and appreciating. So it isn't just the mere fact that somebody could become a trustee, is the expertise of managing an asset that you may not have the day-to-day experience with. Is that something that a lot of us are skilled to do? So even the introduction of it, begs that question, at least.
I don't know if it's a question of skill because it's very specific in stating that it's a trust company. Mm-hmm. So there's no individual accountant or whoever who is going to be able to provide those services under the legislation. The legislation, as it relates to blind trust, is essentially one section, which should tell you straight off the bat is inadequate. So you need to build that out with some regulations. That's where y'all would come in to say, what is suitable for a trust deed to maintain the lack of sight, which in a very small, closed society where everybody, family to everybody, is going to be a very strange bird to deal with, quite frankly. And it's really not that blind because you know what you have when it goes into the trust. So you could, unless the declaration requires you to say when something falls out of the trust, you can then make your decisions and still have your conflicts of interest based on what is in your trust in any event. So that is one of the areas that does require some work. And yes, the US Congress is replete with instances of how this thing is just a joke. It's also in England. I mean, if you don't want to use the North American counterpart as an example, you have different rules and requirements in Westminster in England. And there are too many examples of how you can get around the operation of the legislation if you are not very, very pedantic as to how it is to operate. But if there are 5,000 individual accountants in Barbados, that helps nobody unless y'all get together and form a trust company that you can then turn around and provide those services.
Thank you.
Just a fun fact, as I said, if you want to investigate the debate in 2020, Senator Caswell Franklin, as he then was, did the dog and the puppy in relation to the blind trust, if anybody wants to go and see how that went.
Except I think some of these, of course, we no longer get the official gazette to read the parliamentary debates, but it might be informative for ICAP to get permission of the Honorable President of the Senate. Yeah, no, but wearing his presidential hat as the Senate to give leave to publish in these salient information that's there, or at least get it in a way that we can have it, so be informed. Now, I didn't know that, because the press, bless their hearts, did not reflect any of those valuable contributions that my friend, Mr. Boyce, says Senator Tate spoke to. Reading the papers and following the debate, we will not have known that those points were made. So we need to know. So we need to get some mechanism of asking His Honor, the Honorable Regent, and tell him, listen, please, if you're a worthwhile member of ICAP, step up to the plate and give it to us.
To be fair, it's available on YouTube though. Not my thing, but you can see the entire thing on.
No, but something. People like to send me things by WhatsApp. A 47-page document with WhatsApp. I don't read things on WhatsApp like 47 pages. I have to call my wife and say, please, migrate this to my email so I can print it and I can walk away and read it when I want to. I mean, give me a break. I'm an old man. But seriously, I want to pose a question to you, the audience. Because this is a two-way street. Do you think commissioners on the Integrity Commission should be paid? And if so, how much?
I'm going to let you make a contribution.
I would suggest that they should be paid a substantial amount, because if well maybe on par with a minister or above a minister's pay.
I like the answer. But I had a standing joke. When I was chairman of the Employment Rights Tribunal, I was occasionally engaged in conversation, and it ended up usually saying, well, you were paid well. I said, how well? And they usually came up with a figure that I said, oh Lord, if only it was that. I've been given figures of not less than $10,000 up to $15,000. I said, really? So when I eventually tell them what I was paid and was paid for the duration of my 4.5 years of service, they almost had a cardiac arrest. All I would tell you is this, that at no time in the 4.5 years, when I filed my income tax return, because it's all taxable, I ever declared $8,000 for a year. For a year. Yes, sir.
Follow-up question. If, as I suggested, the commissioners should get paid as much as a minister or more, because based on what we're hearing, the amount was expected of those commissioners. They need to be compensated because basically going to spend a lot of time and the responsibility placed on them. Having said all of that, where this money can come from?
That's the point. Well, Mr. Bruce made a good point, though. I don't agree with $10,000 or a minister's side unless you're going to do the work commensurate with what a minister has to do. You must be paid for work, not just because you hold a title. You know, I have a view that people must. Office is for service, not to enhance the CV. And you don't go around collecting offices and appointments to enhance the CV. If that's your game, get with it down. However, I don't think the levels of compensation do come anywhere close to really attracting people. And in the circumstances, a lot of it is public service. I see absolutely no reason that whatever pittance they pay, it shall not be tax-free. It's honorarium.
Mm-hmm.
It's honorarium. I got $310 a month and $155 a session, whether it lasted 10 minutes or 4 hours.
Yeah.
And I got nothing for writing a judgment. Nothing. When I asked Mr. Felix, the chief labor officer of the day, what do you pay for writing judgments? His mouth fell. I got to pay for them. And you know something? Writing a judgment isn't like picking a breakfast off a tree. When you start into the issue of writing something, it consumes you. You fall asleep and something hits you. You say, I got to fix that tomorrow morning. The good news I have to tell you is that when I delivered it, I put it out of my mind. Well, until I delivered it, it is an albatross on my back. But there is no incentive whatsoever for public service at those rates. Now, some people like collecting them because they're good for their CV, and they're not necessarily going to do the work. If you want to have a commissioner, an integrity commissioner, and they're going to do the work that Mr. Bruce says happens in Jamaica, you should have grades of commission if you want to. Executive commissioners and non-executive have a different rate. But nothing should come below a minimum four-figure sum. Because just being available to consult with is time and has value. Yes, sir.
Therein lies the problem in our civil service. If you pay peanuts, you encourage people to get involved in corruption. Our policemen, our teachers, and several persons in the civil service are paid too low. So you allow corruption to get into the civil service to allow them to better themselves. And therein lies the problem, or one of the problems. I also believe that position is as such that, I don't know if it's paid as much as a minister, but it should be paid commensurate with what people will make in the private sector as CEOs.
Yes, I agree. I think you should get at least 2/3 of what Goddard's CEO gets to avoid you being prey to corruption as an integrity commissioner. And it should be a full-time job. That's me as a member of the audience, not speaking for IGB.
I was
at
going to
this
ask if you
point.
know what the gutter CEO makes.
Enough money. So, yeah.
But I want to say this to people. I've lived and worked in 2 other Caribbean countries, and one of the things I am comfortable saying, unashamedly, that Barbados is really not as corrupt as people hold it out to be.
I agree.
I like to say to you that I think that wars and all, close on 95 point something there, 98% of monies raised for Barbados is used for the purposes of Barbados.
Agreed.
I lived in a place that whose name I will not call, but it was apparent that things there were different. And given the amount of money that happened, I mean, and there were all those people, the scandals that there were. We have, think back on it over the last 55, it's coming up to 57 years of independence. Barbados is always good at whisper things on the
Grapevine.
grapevine. But seriously, would tell me how much corruption that you've heard endemic, say in Trinidad, where several ministers left Trinidad to avoid arrest and died in exile in Canada. I think the name Halloran and other people who were big ministers in Eric Williams' government were. How many can you call in that regard in Barbados? We know of a few names that were called, and Duffus in part exposed some of it. But generally speaking, as a Barbadian who've lived abroad, there's not that massive scale corruption. I tell you what's the problem here. Huh? We have what they call soft corruption. And the soft corruption comes, as I think Alicia and I should discuss it, in certain government departments. If you don't do certain things or remember the right Christmas gift in December, you're suffering pure gripe in the new year. That's the reality. There's a certain department where a file was accidentally activated while the substantive officer was on holiday. And when he came back, he almost had a stroke. What is so you touched that file for? That was my retirement fund. What is so you move it for? But that is the exception. Barbados is, we like to bad talk people. We like to bad talk the politician. And when somebody gets jailed outside of Barbados, he said more should be jailed in Barbados. Yes, sir.
I take the point, but ultimately we don't know because our integrity system is just wildly inadequate. So the reason why we've not really had any real cases is because there's no net to catch them. And that is why we are here. We need the net to catch them. We can't tell me that in the last 7 years it's not been occurring. But to put a response to your question, where does the money come from? I will ask you or tell you, what is the cost of corruption? So the OECD did an estimate and research on developing countries like Barbados, and the cost of corruption was between 5 to 10% of GDP. In Barbados' context, that's over $500 million per year. I'm sure you will not be paying a commission over $500 million per year. So the cost is there. When we think about good governance, it's not just corruption, hard corruption. It's malfeasance, for instance, as well. So you have badly written contracts, for instance, that inflate costs. I saw the other day a roundabout costing $4 million. If precisely no termination clause, endless contracts, the bullet loans that we've had, for instance, and those various type of things. Think of a $4 million house, and then think of a roundabout. Tell me how does a roundabout cost $4 million? So we have to be serious. there are heavily inflated costs within our governance system, and that has been happening over several administrations. Several administrations, I wouldn't call some of the things that come to mind, for instance, but it exists. It may not be a politician grabbing anything out the treasury and putting it in his pocket and going home, but then you have things like kickbacks where things are exorbitantly priced, and we have to ask questions as to why. But the only way we can know that is when we have things such as a contractor general, for instance, or at least legislation that deals with the administration of contracts. We've not had that. We had that responsibility under the guise of a cabinet, and nobody asks any serious questions as to why certain buildings cost this amount, certain highways cost this amount, certain roundabouts cost this amount. We just accept it as that is the cost. Is there anything that's genuinely competitive as it relates to bidding? Are we able to see the bids? Are we able to see who has, in essence, put forward their bids, who can, I don't want to say undercut, but produce something in a more effective and cost-effective manner? We don't have that information at our disposal. So we can't say that, Barbados is so much better than anybody else because we don't have the net to see what is actually happening. And that is the problem.
In that regard, again, I'm going to send you back if you want to see the debate in the Senate. I believe it was Senator Dr. Christina Hines who echoed some similar sentiments to what Mr. Bruce is indicating, and also that there was a reference to an article done by a colleague, at least you might remember him, Dirk Harrison. He was actually the contractor general in Jamaica, and he did a report for Transparency International with regard to the Caribbean and corruption and perception. And he had some interesting things to say about Barbados, and you could go and do your investigation and see what that shows.
I actually wanted to, similar to what Deveron would have pointed to, we are talking about how much you're going to pay someone, but we haven't spoken to what qualifications that they're going to have to be able to command a particular pay skill, and not qualifications only in terms of books or education and such, because you have persons, as you mentioned, who would be going around and collecting titles and accolades and stuff like that, but they don't have a body of work to show that they can run an effective project and be able to bring things to a conclusion. So you want to make sure that in your quest to make sure people are paid fairly, they're also not just qualified, but capable of doing the work that's expected, because it's going to be a significant task that's going to be put before them. And we would see this example as well too, where we recently had the case with the Springer simulation. And when the principal was questioned as to what were the qualifications of the persons who would have been on the committee that made these decisions, the only answer you could get is that they were qualified. We don't know qualified in what. We don't know if they were trained in what they were supposed to be doing. And then you don't have anything. I wanted to get the name of the body you mentioned before in terms of even getting to disciplinary matters. You're not even admitting that this is something that would be worthy of discipline in the first place. So then you have a matter where we're not recognizing when a failure has occurred, which means we're encouraging mediocrity within our systems. And we don't want a body like the Integrity Commission to also fall prey to what happens across so many sectors, whether it be intentional or unintentional. Because there are cases where I think persons genuinely believe that they are qualified for doing certain positions or certain work, but then when you put that measuring stick there, they're woefully inadequate. So we want to make sure that we understand what is expected of a commission member, what qualifications they should have, so that we have the persons who are best suited for the job even before we start talking about pay. And then the pay can be commensurate with those qualifications, so that you can then say, okay, yes, if this person used to be a CEO of Goddard's, for example, just going off your example, then the 2/3 pay would be expected because you saw the results that they would have had under that particular organization, and you would expect similar. If the person was an effective accounting assistant and you could see that they have a body of work, they can be paid commensurate to what they would have been paid before. But to put out a broad figure or number without having those factors included, you then lead to an imbalance where the persons may be expected to do work that's beyond their capabilities, and then also lead to failures within the organization.
Sure. I think it's interesting you say that qualifications and how people are assessed, continuing assessments, etc., is actually addressed in the UN convention, which we've incorporated into our domestic legislation. There are a number of practices government has that just can't work, like last in, first out, regardless of whether you just marking time, you know. However, I don't know if you're speaking to the commissioners themselves, because the requirements for those people are actually set out in the act. So you would have a judge of the Commonwealth, etc. Right. But the staffing is probably where that would more come into play, and the commission itself is in charge of its own staffing. So that is another area that would need to be fleshed out as well. I mean, obviously, you would have to have somebody set up proper job descriptions, etc., as to what they need to do. The problem is that a lot of the other agencies that are involved are really not within the control of the commission. For example, the police force. So the constable that's assigned to you may not necessarily be the most competent constable. That is within the purview of the commissioner. So it's kind of, I don't know, a very roundabout problem that I'm not sure that there is a specific solution to as it relates to that. But there is a requirement that there be proper assessments of staff, proper promotion, proper consideration of staffing, etc.
May I ask? My issue is who exactly would appoint the commissioner? Who pays him? Who appoints him? Does he have authority over everybody in Barbados? Because I'm thinking of the accountant general's job, but he's appointed by the government, I believe, and regardless of what he says year after year, nothing seems to happen.
Right.
The auditor general, I'm sorry. So nothing seems to happen. And I'm thinking, if you have somebody, an integrity commissioner, wouldn't it be the same thing? Because
No.
the people.
So the commission is a little different. There are specific ways of those people being selected. So, for instance, there's one that should be a judge of the Commonwealth, which is a really limited pool of people. You have an attorney at law of not less than 10 years standing to be selected by the Bar Association as a whole. You have a person representing the church, I believe. You have selected by the president. You have an individual then that is selected by the president.
Don't forget
the accountant. And they did not specifically say ICAB. They said the body, a body representative of accountants. So I don't know what that is besides y'all. And then you have a person that of good reputation, essentially, that the president selects on consultation with the prime minister. You have one that the president selects on consultation with the opposition leader. That itself needs amendment, because clearly we've now had a good few years where there is no such thing really. So that, you might need to make a provision then for, if there is no leader of the opposition, how that extra person is to be selected. So it's not a case where it's like a job like the Auditor General, where you apply for a job and you get it. They're fail safes, I suppose, with to account for certain people. I guess the Bar Association, for instance, would have to come up with its own procedure for selecting that person, to make sure they don't have any disciplinary complaints outstanding, they ain't thief nobody money, them kind of things. It's literally as the same with ICAB and what's not. So that it's not within the control of one person to not staff. It's not staffing, or to form the commission itself.
If I may, just to share with the members of ICAB, we did make representation that particular part of the legislation be changed to have the same reference to ICAB as the Bar Association had. That was ignored, and the language continued. Nonetheless, ICAB has taken upon itself to actually create a short list of individuals that we feel would be credible to sit.
Okay, is there another body, just for my own, there is another one besides ICAB?
There is no other regulator of the accounting profession in
Right.
Barbados other than ICAB.
Okay. Yeah. So that's you.
Any more questions?
But part of the difficulty is that when you look at the first schedule, the Integrity Commission, as is constituted, is essentially going to be like the board of any statutory corporation. And then it's then going to be dependent upon the staffing structure that they put in place. So the chairman, notwithstanding his lofty title, is essentially going to be dependent upon the staffing. And the frequency of meetings and the regularity of the business structure is going to be a large measure as to how they sit down and plan going forward. And I will say that, whenever it is constituted, I will think that the first order of business will be for the chairman designate and the persons considered to be should go and sit down for a couple of weeks with the mature integrity commissions in the Caribbean. Jamaica seems to have done it. And I say Jamaica too because over the years I've got songs out of Trinidad to suggest that their house is not always in good shape. So I think you need to sit down and go and learn and see what needs to be done to make it happen. But I go back to what I said at the outset. We really need to have a commitment from government sooner rather than later that they really mean to make this happen. The point raised by Alicia and Devon about financing and structure to what is going to be means for it. I'm not for the Minister of Finance to tell you, well, I'm not sure whether you're going to get you through the House, get an appropriation for you, and you get a cut. Or that if in a couple of years after you're established, it is my fault institution comes along and said you have to cut staff along the board, along the way, that the Integrity Commission suffers that cut as well. Because when these cuts happen, they usually impact at a level that hurts. You might think it doesn't matter, but not having that body at the front desk to receive the papers and process them is critical to sometimes for the thing to happen. And you can't outsource everything. One of my private beefs is that you can't ring anywhere in Barbados now and ask somebody to answer the telephone. All right? And if you ring a government department and you put on pause, I am about to go bonkers of hearing that play back. This is how we are. I can't sing. But so basic staffing is critical and essential to make the Integrity Commission happen. This exercise is valuable, but I think we need to go, as Alicia said, Devon said, we need to go and have a town hall in the schools, and also, notwithstanding that is on Zoom it into the homes and let people participate and call in on the programs. But it should not be on the expenditure of ICAP. Just as the government has put resources behind the Constitutional Reform Commission to enable it to do its work, if they want this to happen, they have to put resources behind it for you to do your public outreach. So whatever is necessary. I don't know which line ministry you fall under. You must find somebody to take you on board and not treat you like what I said to you, like some institutions, a bastard, illegitimate, orphan, as some bodies we end up being. Okay. So this is really what is necessary for this to happen. If not, like the Teaching Service Commission, we might be talking about this for another 48 years. I won't be here in 48 years. I won't be here in 940, yeah? I mean, Lisa might be. Lisa might be. And my Lisa over there might be. But I certainly wouldn't be. Anyway. But certainly, there's the current Integrity Commission structure is essentially executive board to run. Is the staff that's going to be important? Who they identify as their executive director to be the body who has the skill sets, and to set up a level that he can be command the right, he or she. No, let me tell you something there.
Oh no.
On the interpretation act, male embraces female. So there's no. I am sorry. I've been given a lecture on gender thing, and I'm a little. I apologize. Male, he or she, and certainly, the person I have in mind to be the project director to find. I have two women in mind actually, either of whom can go and be the persons to push the doors, who are retired from the private sector. Failing them too is all backup is another female. Because I'll tell you something, my commission has been given one of the most hardworking, resourceful persons in the public service, who knows where they told her where the bodies are buried and which undertaker to find to exhume them. And I am grateful in no small measure that she's there to make my work happen. So public servants of a high level are indispensable, and they really do Barbados proud. But so much as they say that Barbados is probably, we're losing 5%. Don't beat up on ourselves. We are not as corrupt as people hold ourselves out to be. And the fact that, but the bad news is the thin edge. Is people getting the license to get ZRs and getting planning permissions that they shouldn't get, that give us a bad name. And all sorts of things that happen. And then they get rewarded at the end of the day, as you see rewards coming on the 30th of November. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm impugning anybody who gets rewarded on 30th of November. But
Thank you. Okay, any final comments from the audience? Well, let's thank the panel. Thank you so much for your contribution tonight. It was very entertaining on some ends.
Before we do that, I want to know, you think I have another life as a comedian? So I want to boost my CV.
Well, thank you, thank you all. It's just for me now to really bring a cap to this evening's proceedings and do the usual thank yous. And first of all, I just want to thank the esteemed panel. It had some great effervescence. Certainly, we have on the state of effervescence, we had retired Justice Christopher Blackman, who's the chairman of the Constitution Reform Commission. We want to thank you so much. Honorable Kevin Boyce, independent senator. Certainly want to thank you as well. Alicia Archer, attorney at law and IGB director. And of course, Devon Bruce, political scientist and IGB member as well. And of course, there's the moderator who got all the insight from her panelists. Dr. Gatri Mahabir, who is the member of ICAB's Ethics and Governance and Risk Committee. We want to thank you all, and I want you, the audience, to join with me and thank them so very much. Well, I began without even introducing myself. I took it for granted that you know who I am. A mistake of mine, but I'm the Vice President of the Institute of Chartered Accountants. My name is Damien Skeet, and I am truly happy to see so many of you who took the opportunity to be part of this discussion. If you can also give yourselves a round of applause. You were so interactive as well, which is always good. That's how you get the most out of these type of sessions, right? So you didn't just sit down, you were quite interactive. Some key takeaways that I thought we had here is that the suite of legislation is really not the destination, but certainly it is something that we have to take the journey on to build out and to establish that keyword purpose, which is right there on our banner, the ICAB banner, purpose, so we can get some structure to it. And of course, we have to bring public awareness, and it starts here as well. We need to go down into the nook and cranny, to really get the message out there and educate the public. So I believe it's a great start here that we've done this evening, but certainly the work must continue, right? Having said that, I also want to express great thanks to the engine behind putting this together. So we had a partnership between the IGB and ICAB, and of course, the behind the scenes in the Secretariat, who does all the work in bringing something like this together. So I want you to also give them a round of applause. And lastly, I would also want to thank the LESC, for providing us with such cool surroundings, simple things like air condition, where we can be comfortable and have such an interactive and engaging session. So I want to thank them as well. And we have members of the media who are here. We want to thank them, and we look forward to seeing what they give some more public awareness as in the days ahead. All right. So thank you so much. Don't run away. We are going to have, oh yeah, and there's a QR code. We are technologically savvy now. So we have the QR code where we can scan so you can give feedback. It's right at the desk behind. Some of you would have gotten and received a word on the entrance, but failing that, go to the back of the desk, QR code, and give us your feedback. Certainly, we will take it on board. Huh? So it's left for me now to get out of the way, and let's mingle. Let's continue the conversation that we started so nicely here over some beverages and some light refreshments. All right, thanks.